It was a quiet afternoon in a small suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where everyone knew each other yet still respected privacy. The sun shone gently, reflecting off the well-kept lawns and neat sidewalks. In the middle of this calm setting lived a highly respected U.S. general. He was a man in his 50s, strong and disciplined, with a presence that commanded attention without demanding it. People admired him not just for his rank but for his character, the way he treated others, and the stories of courage and leadership that followed him like shadows. Despite his achievements, he lived simply. His home was modest, but every corner told a story of order, discipline, and thoughtfulness. He wasn't flashy or showy. He valued principles over possessions. His neighbors would often see him tending to his garden, helping the elderly carry groceries, or chatting politely with children in the neighborhood. To them, he was more than a general. He was a pillar of the community, someone they could rely on if trouble ever came. But not everyone who looked at the general felt admiration. Some felt envy, curiosity, and a hint of challenge. Among them was a police officer from a nearby district, a man who often acted without thinking, driven more by ego than judgment. He had heard rumors about the general's home, whispers that there was a safe inside containing something valuable, though no one really knew what. The officer didn't consider legality or morality. He thought of it as a challenge, a way to test his cunning against someone of high authority. That afternoon, while the general was attending a small community event, a local charity meeting where he helped distribute supplies to families in need, the officer watched from a distance. He saw the general laugh with children, sign autographs, and shake hands with neighbors. The officer's mind, however, wasn't on the good the general did. His mind was on the safe, the mystery, the possibility of proving himself smarter than a man who had fought battles and led men. He spent the next few days planning. Every detail mattered to him. He observed when the general left the house, when he returned, which doors were locked, and how the house was laid out. He didn't know it yet, but the general had spent decades training himself to anticipate challenges, to think ahead in every possible scenario. What the officer saw as an opportunity, the general saw as a test waiting to happen. Late one evening, the officer finally decided it was time. The neighborhood was quiet, the streets almost empty, and a light drizzle made the world shine like glass under the street lamps. He moved carefully, though not without a hint of arrogance in his step. He had convinced himself that the general was out, that the house would be empty, and that he could gain access to the safe without anyone noticing. Inside the general's home, everything was as ordered as ever. The living room was immaculate, the study neatly arranged, and the safe tucked away in a corner, almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The general himself was still at the community event. Unaware that someone was about to test his vigilance in the most unusual way, the officer approached the study quietly, feeling the thrill of what he considered a secret mission. He knelt in front of the safe, examining the lock. It was sturdy, professional, and designed to resist tampering. For the officer, that was part of the excitement. He had done this before, cracked locks, outsmarted security systems, but this felt different. There was something about the house, about the general's aura, that made the air feel tense. He began to work on the lock. At first it was simple. He was confident, smiling to himself, imagining the moment he would open it and prove his skill. Minutes passed. The sound of his tools scratching and clicking filled the silent study. The officer thought he was clever, but he didn't realize that the general had anticipated curiosity like his. The safe was not just secure, it was clever. It had mechanisms that were rarely used, traps that could turn arrogance into embarrassment in an instant. Outside, the neighborhood remained quiet, unaware of the drama unfolding inside one home. The rain had stopped, leaving puddles on the pavement reflecting the dim glow of streetlights. The officer's concentration was complete. He didn't hear the creak of the front door, didn't notice the subtle movement in the shadows. He believed he was invisible, untouchable, and about to succeed where many might fail. And then, the first subtle click happened. Not the click of the lock opening, but something else. Something small, almost imperceptible. The officer paused, listening. He shrugged, thinking it was just his imagination. He resumed working. The minutes dragged on, tension building. He tried different techniques, all standard methods he had used countless times before. Nothing worked. Frustration began to creep in, but it was mixed with excitement. He was determined to succeed. What the officer didn't know was that the general had installed a system that was as clever as it was harmless. Years of anticipating trouble, of thinking ahead, of preparing for unexpected scenarios had led him to create a simple, yet effective safeguard. It was not about theft prevention alone. It was about teaching lessons about humility and foresight, and ensuring that arrogance would never go unchallenged in his home. Finally, after several minutes, the officer felt something shift. A click, a subtle movement, and he thought he had finally won. His heart raced. He smiled, ready to celebrate his supposed victory. He reached for the handle, and at that exact moment the room erupted in color. A splash of bright paint shot out from the safe, drenching the officer completely. Red, yellow, blue, colors collided on his uniform, his face, his hands. The shock was immediate. He staggered backward, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The officer froze, soaked and stunned, while the paint dripped around him like confetti in slow motion. The smell was strong, the wetness sticky, and the humiliation crushing. He realized instantly that he had underestimated not just the safe, but the mind behind it. The general's foresight had turned the officer's arrogance into a lesson he would never forget. From the doorway, barely making a sound, the general appeared. Calm, composed, and almost smiling, he watched the scene unfold. There was no anger in his eyes, only a quiet acknowledgement of the officer's foolishness. He said nothing at first, allowing the officer to process the reality of what had just happened. It was a moment filled with tension, irony, and an unspoken lesson about respect, intelligence, and the consequences of overconfidence. The officer's initial shock turned into panic. He tried to wipe the paint from his face to regain some dignity, but the more he struggled, the messier he became. He looked up at the general, realizing that no amount of explanation could undo the mistake. The general, without a word, simply stood there, radiating authority. In that moment, the officer understood something he hadn't before. True power didn't come from force. Speed or rank, it came from foresight, patience, and integrity. Even as he scrambled to clean himself, the officer felt a shift inside him. Humiliation burned, yes, but also clarity. He realized how reckless he had been, how arrogance had blinded him, and how he had disrespected not just a man, but a life of discipline, service, and wisdom. The neighborhood, still unaware, remained peaceful. But inside that study, a lesson had been learned in the most memorable way imaginable. The general, ever calm, finally spoke in a quiet voice. "Some things are not meant to be taken lightly," he said, not accusatory but firm. "Curiosity without respect can lead to mistakes." The officer nodded, the words sinking in. He had expected confrontation, perhaps even anger, but instead he found a teaching moment he would never forget. As he left the house, still dripping with paint, the officer glanced back. The general had returned to his study, his demeanor unchanged, as if nothing unusual had happened. And yet everything had changed for the officer, for the lesson, and for the understanding of what true respect and intelligence meant. That night, the story would remain a secret between them, yet it marked the beginning of a transformation. The officer would never look at the general, or at situations requiring judgment in the same way again. And the general, quietly returning to his routine, knew that foresight, patience, and preparation had once again proven more powerful than arrogance and impulsiveness. The officer stood frozen for a few seconds, dripping in bright, sticky paint. His heart raced and his mind struggled to process what had just happened. Every plan, every calculation, every assumption he had made seemed to crash around him like broken glass. The colorful mess covering his uniform, his hair, and even his face felt like a living reminder of his arrogance. He had walked into the house thinking he could outsmart a man whose reputation was legendary. And now, standing in the study, he realized he had been utterly wrong. For a moment, the officer thought of running. He imagined slipping out the door, disappearing into the night, and telling no one about this incident. But even as he considered it, he felt a strange mixture of fear, shame, and curiosity rooting him to the spot. This was no ordinary house, and this was no ordinary man. The general, calm and composed, didn't yell or rush toward him. He simply stood near the doorway, arms folded, watching silently. There was no anger in his eyes, only an almost imperceptible smile and the quiet weight of authority. The officer tried to speak, to explain, to justify his actions, but the words caught in his throat. He opened his mouth several times, only to shut it again. Any explanation sounded weak even in his own mind. The general tilted his head slightly, making it clear that he didn't need words to make his point. The message was simple. Arrogance without respect has consequences. It was in that moment that the officer first began to feel the true weight of what had happened. He had underestimated the general in every way. Not just his intelligence, but his foresight, his ability to plan, and his calm, unshakable demeanor. The safe had been a test, and he had failed spectacularly. The paint wasn't just a prank. It was a lesson wrapped in color, a reminder that impulsive actions have unexpected consequences. As the officer attempted to wipe the paint from his eyes, he felt the cold wetness dripping down his face. It was uncomfortable, humiliating, and completely unavoidable. He noticed the vibrant colors spreading across the study floor, splashing over the neat carpet and the polished wooden furniture. Every movement he made seemed to smear the paint further, a literal and figurative mess of his own making. Finally, after several deep breaths, he looked up and met the general's eyes. For the first time, he saw the full measure of the man standing before him. This was not a person who relied on fear or intimidation. This was someone who commanded respect simply through presence, through careful planning, and through a lifetime of discipline. The officer realized he had treated the general like an object of curiosity rather than a person, and that realization cut deeper than the embarrassment of being drenched in paint. "Sir," the officer said, his voice shaking slightly. I didn't mean any harm. I thought—" He stopped, realizing that anything he said now sounded hollow. The general's calm gaze didn't waver. There was no anger, no shouting, only a quiet authority that made the officer feel exposed in every sense. The general finally spoke, his voice steady and measured. "Curiosity is natural, but acting without respect or consideration is dangerous. You assumed you could outsmart me, yet you didn't stop to think about the consequences of your actions." His words were not meant to punish, but to teach, and the officer felt each one settle heavily on his conscience. The officer swallowed hard. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but he couldn't. Every instinct that had driven him to this point, pride, ego, the need to prove himself, now felt foolish. He realized that he had been blinded by arrogance, ignoring not only the general's reputation, but the fundamental truth that wisdom often comes from calm observation and foresight, not brute effort. Meanwhile, the general walked slowly toward the officer, each step deliberate. He didn't touch him, didn't shout, didn't threaten. Instead, he simply observed the situation, allowing the officer to absorb the lesson fully. There was a quiet dignity in the way he moved, a sense of control that made the officer feel even smaller in comparison. "Look around you," the general continued. "This house, this study, this safe, it's all a reflection of careful thought, planning, and respect for what matters. You see a challenge, a mystery, something to conquer. I see a life built on discipline, experience, and foresight. There is a difference between curiosity and intrusion, and there is a difference between arrogance and intelligence." The officer nodded slowly, the words sinking in. He felt a mix of shame and admiration, shame for his impulsive actions, and admiration for the general's ability to teach without anger, to command respect without threats, and to turn a moment of potential conflict into a lesson he would never forget. Time seemed to stretch in that quiet study. The officer realized how foolish he had been, and he began to reflect on the choices that led him here. He thought about the countless times he had acted impulsively in his own life, assuming that quick action would bring results. He thought about the pride that had driven him to underestimate others, to dismiss caution and to ignore wisdom. And he realized that in all of those moments he had been missing something essential: respect. Respect for others, respect for their experience, and respect for the consequences of his own actions. The general, noticing the officer's silence, took a step back and gestured toward the door. "You need to understand that lessons are often clearer when experienced directly. Go home, reflect, and remember what you've learned tonight. Actions have consequences, and humility is a strength, not a weakness." The officer, dripping paint and feeling a mixture of embarrassment and enlightenment, nodded again. He felt an unfamiliar sense of gratitude toward the general. Despite being humiliated, he recognized that he had been given an opportunity to grow, to understand something he had long ignored. This was not punishment for punishment's sake. It was a teaching moment, carefully crafted and delivered with calm authority. As he left the house, he could still feel the wet paint clinging to his clothes and skin. Every step was a reminder of his mistake, but also a reminder of the lesson he had learned. Outside, the quiet neighborhood seemed unchanged, but for him, the world had shifted. He had entered the general's home with arrogance and left with humility. Over the next few days, the officer reflected repeatedly on what had happened. The paint, he realized, was more than just a colorful mess. It symbolized the mark of experience, the visible proof that actions without thought or respect can leave a lasting impact. He began to think about how he had treated others in his life, how many times he had acted without considering the consequences, and how much he still had to learn about humility and foresight. The story of the incident, while largely unknown to the outside world, became a turning point for the officer. He approached his work differently, listened more, and learned to think before acting. The general, for his part, continued his daily routine, calm and unshaken, knowing that his quiet lesson had been delivered and understood. Neighbors who saw the officer later, dripping in paint but reflective and subdued, whispered among themselves, but no one really knew the full story. The general never boasted about the event, never sought attention, and never used it to elevate himself. The lesson was private, profound, and lasting. In the weeks that followed, the officer would occasionally glance back at that study, at the safe, and at the man who had taught him one of the most important lessons of his life. It was a reminder that true intelligence is not shown through bold actions alone, but through foresight, patience, and the ability to teach without anger. The paint, vivid and unmistakable, had left a mark not just on his uniform but on his character. And so, what began as a night of foolish arrogance ended as a story of humility, reflection, and growth. The officer learned that no matter how skilled, clever, or confident one might feel, there is always someone who has thought ahead, who has patience, and who understands the true value of respect. The general had shown in the quietest yet most striking way that wisdom often comes not from force or confrontation, but from calm observation, preparation, and the ability to turn mistakes into lessons. The next morning, the neighborhood woke to an unusual sight. Across the street, sunlight glinted off puddles left from the previous evening's rain, and the quiet calm of the morning seemed almost ordinary. But for some residents, there was a ripple of curiosity. A few had noticed a figure walking slowly down the street the night before, coated in what looked like bright wet paint, stumbling toward his car. Some had whispered to each other, trying to piece together what they had seen. The officer drove home, still dripping in streaks of red, blue, and yellow paint. Every step he had taken the night before replayed in his mind. He could not shake the image of the general standing calmly in the doorway, arms folded, watching him fumble in embarrassment. That memory both haunted and humbled him. He realized that the moment had not been about punishment or anger. It had been about understanding, reflection, and lessons learned the hard way. Inside his home, he attempted to clean himself. The process was slow and frustrating. The paint had dried in some areas, clinging stubbornly to his uniform hair and skin. As he scrubbed, he thought about how differently things could have gone if he had just paused and thought before acting. That reflection brought a wave of shame, but also a strange sense of clarity. He realized that he had spent years relying on quick decisions, impulsive judgment, and the assumption that boldness would carry him through any situation. That night, the boldness had not saved him. It had exposed him. Meanwhile, in the general's neighborhood, word of the strange incident began to spread, though mostly through hushed conversation. Some neighbors had been up late, seeing the officer leave in his colorful state, and the story quickly became a topic of quiet fascination. People speculated about what had happened inside the house, creating small narratives in their minds. Was it a prank? Was it some kind of training exercise? Most agreed on one thing. The general had handled the situation with wisdom and composure. Back at his home, the officer sat quietly thinking. He began to recognize patterns in his own life, times he had acted without foresight, moments when he had been overconfident, and occasions where arrogance had clouded his judgment. He realized that the paint had done more than embarrass him. It had forced him to stop to examine himself, and to understand that intelligence and skill were meaningless without patience, respect, and humility. Over the next few days, he started noticing things he had never seen before in the general's actions. How he treated people politely, even when there was no apparent benefit. How he anticipated challenges long before they happened. How calm and composed he remained under pressure, never losing control or letting emotion dictate his decisions. These qualities were not flashy or loud. They were quiet, consistent, and effective. And the officer realized that he had underestimated the value of such traits for his entire life. Curiosity soon mixed with embarrassment. At work, colleagues noticed that something had changed. The officer was quieter, more thoughtful, and more attentive. He didn't boast, didn't overcompensate, and avoided trying to prove himself at every opportunity. Even in small decisions, he paused, considering consequences he had once ignored. His reputation began to shift, not because he was more confident or skilled, but because he was more aware, more humble, and more capable of learning from experience. Meanwhile, the general returned to his routines as if nothing had happened. He visited the local community center, helped with neighborhood activities, and continued his exercises in the park. For him, the incident had been over almost as soon as it happened. Yet he was aware of its ripple effects. The officer had learned a lesson, the neighborhood had gained a story, and the principle of respect had been quietly reinforced. The officer, reflecting on the events, realized something deeper. The embarrassment, the pain, the sudden shock, they had all served a purpose. They forced him to confront the parts of himself he had ignored: impatience, impulsiveness, and a lack of respect for others' experience. The general had designed a simple, harmless system to teach a powerful lesson. The officer understood that real leadership, real wisdom, and true authority didn't come from force or intimidation. It came from foresight, preparation, and the ability to guide others through example rather than fear. As the days turned into a week, the officer found himself thinking about the general more often. He remembered small details: the neatness of the house, the precision with which the safe had been designed, and the quiet dignity with which the general had handled the entire situation. These reflections began to influence how he interacted with people, how he approached challenges, and how he made decisions. He realized that humility was not weakness. It was strength tempered by awareness. One afternoon, as he walked through the neighborhood, he noticed the general tending to his garden. The officer stopped, hesitated, and then decided to approach. "Sir," he said, voice quiet and respectful, I wanted to apologize again and also to thank you. I understand now that I acted foolishly and I hope to learn from it." The general paused and looked at him calmly. "Actions speak louder than words," he said simply. "Show respect in everything you do, and you will learn far more than any punishment could teach. The lesson is already yours if you are willing to keep it." That moment became a turning point. The officer felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He didn't need the general to lecture him or scold him. The experience itself had spoken volumes. The paint, the embarrassment, the quiet observation, all of it combined into a lesson that would stay with him for years. Over the following weeks, small changes in the officer's life became noticeable. At work, he paused before making decisions. He listened more than he spoke. He treated others with greater respect, understanding that every person has knowledge, experience, and foresight that deserves consideration. He realized that quick solutions without thought often lead to mistakes, and that patience and observation often produce the best results. Even in his personal life, the experience left an impact. He reflected on past relationships, opportunities he had missed, and moments when arrogance had pushed him toward trouble. He recognized that humility wasn't just about this single incident. It was about a mindset that could guide his life forward. The paint had marked him physically, but it had also left an invisible mark on his character, shaping his actions and choices. The neighborhood continued to whisper about the incident, though details remained vague. Some spoke of the officer's colorful appearance, others of the mysterious general who seemed untouchable and wise. But the real story, the lesson, remained between them. The officer didn't boast about it, and the general never publicized it. It was a private transformation, witnessed only by those who were present and those who chose to reflect deeply on their actions. At home, the officer sometimes thought back to that rainy night. He imagined how different things could have been if he had acted with respect, humility, and patience. He realized that courage alone is not enough. Intelligence and foresight are equally important. He began to understand that every action, no matter how small, carries consequences, and that understanding those consequences is what separates impulsiveness from wisdom. The general, meanwhile, continued quietly in his life. He returned to the community, visited schools, and maintained his disciplined routine. He never flaunted the incident or used it for recognition. To him, the lesson had been delivered, and the ripple effect, though subtle, was enough. The officer had learned humility, and that was the true reward. One evening, as the officer reflected on the past week, he realized something profound. The experience had not been about him versus the general. It had been about the right way to approach life. About the value of respect, foresight, and humility. About understanding that true authority is quiet, deliberate, and patient. And most importantly, about recognizing that lessons often come in unexpected forms, sometimes as embarrassment, sometimes as mistakes, and sometimes as colorful paint sprayed across your uniform. He smiled faintly at the memory, knowing he had changed. That night, as he cleaned the last stubborn streaks of paint from his hair, he made a promise to himself. He would approach life differently, think before acting, and treat others with the respect they deserved. The incident, once humiliating, had become a foundation for growth. And in that realization, he found something more valuable than pride or ego, a sense of understanding, humility, and clarity. Days passed since the paint incident, but the memory of that night remained vivid for the officer. Each time he closed his eyes, he could see the general standing calmly in the doorway, arms folded, watching him fumble, dripping with colors. At first, the memory had made him feel humiliated and small, but now, as he reflected more deeply, it began to feel like a mirror showing him the truth about himself, a truth he had long avoided. The officer realized he had acted on impulse and ego. He had assumed that quick thinking and boldness were enough to succeed, but the incident had exposed a weakness he hadn't been ready to face. Impatience and disrespect could easily undo confidence and skill. He began to understand that the general's calmness, foresight, and discipline were the real strength. They weren't flashy or aggressive, but they were far more powerful than any quick action could ever be. Curiosity about the neighborhood's reaction soon reached him. Although the story had not spread widely, some neighbors had seen the officer drenched in paint as he left the house. Some of them whispered among themselves about the mysterious general who had managed to turn a potential burglary into a lesson without confrontation. Others speculated on what had happened inside the study. But everyone agreed on one thing. The general had handled the situation with wisdom and patience, and the officer had learned a lesson the hard way. The officer walked through the streets slowly, noticing subtle looks from neighbors. Some offered faint smiles. Others avoided eye contact, unsure whether to speak. He realized that even without words, people could sense a change in him. His posture, his demeanor, his way of moving and speaking, it was different. He felt smaller, quieter, more thoughtful, but also more aware of the consequences of his actions. The humiliation he had felt the night before had transformed into a deep sense of reflection. Back at the general's house, life continued as usual. The general maintained his daily routines, visiting the community center, tending his garden, and speaking with neighbors. He never boasted about the incident or revealed the details to anyone. For him, the lesson had been private and intentional. The officer had learned humility, and that was enough. He believed that knowledge and growth often came through personal experience, and he had given the officer exactly what he needed without anger, lectures, or humiliation beyond what was already necessary. One afternoon, the officer found himself back in front of the general's house, this time in broad daylight. The colorful stains on his uniform from the previous night had long since been washed away, but the memory remained sharp in his mind. He hesitated for a moment before deciding to approach. He knocked softly, unsure if the general would even remember him. The door opened slowly, and the general looked at him calmly. "Hello," he said, his voice measured and steady. The officer felt a wave of respect and nervousness wash over him. "Sir," he began, "I wanted to thank you again. I understand now that my actions were reckless. I realize how wrong I was to act without thinking, and I want to make sure I don't repeat the same mistakes." The general nodded slowly. "Reflection is important," he said, "but understanding isn't enough. Actions moving forward must also change." Respect and humility must guide you, not just knowledge of a mistake. You have the opportunity to act differently from now on. The officer nodded, taking in every word. For the first time, he truly felt the weight of what had happened. The incident was no longer simply embarrassing. It was transformational. He realized that the paint, the mess, and the shock were merely symbols of a deeper lesson about life, respect and foresight. Over the following week, the officer began to notice subtle changes in the community. Neighbors who had witnessed him leaving the house in paint spoke of him with curiosity, but also with respect. They could see the change in his behavior. He was quieter, more attentive, and more considerate. He listened carefully before speaking, thought before acting, and began to approach challenges with patience rather than haste. Every small interaction, every decision, reflected the lesson he had learned. Even in his professional life, the impact was noticeable. The officer began to take time before making quick judgments. He consulted colleagues, listened to advice, and considered the consequences of his actions more carefully. He realized that leadership and skill were not about showing strength through impulsive decisions, but through calm observation, foresight, and the ability to act with respect for others. Meanwhile, the general observed quietly from afar. He didn't intervene directly, but he noticed the changes in the officer's demeanor, both at work and in the neighborhood. The subtle transformation, the way the officer approached people, the care he took in his actions, and the humility he carried, was the real proof that the lesson had been effective. It was a reminder that influence and guidance often work best when delivered quietly, without force or confrontation. One day, the officer returned to the general's garden. The sun was setting, casting warm orange light across the neatly trimmed grass. He approached the general with a mixture of respect and nervousness. "Sir," he said, "I wanted to apologize again and to thank you. I understand now that your calmness and patience were not weakness but strength. I hope to continue learning and acting differently from now on." The general smiled faintly. Growth is not measured by perfection, but by willingness to learn. Remember that respect is earned not just through authority, but through thoughtfulness, humility, and foresight. Carry this lesson with you, and it will guide you better than any quick decision ever could. The officer felt a deep sense of gratitude. He realized that the paint incident, the embarrassment, and the reflection that followed had given him something far more valuable than pride or recognition. He had gained awareness, humility, and a deeper understanding of human character. He understood that mistakes, when faced with honesty and reflection, could be powerful tools for growth. Over time, the neighborhood began to see the officer differently. People who had once judged him for impulsive behavior noticed a change. He treated them with patience, spoke with care, and acted with respect. The story of the paint incident remained largely quiet, but the impact on those who had witnessed the aftermath was evident. They saw that real growth often comes quietly, without fanfare, and that lessons learned from experience can have lasting effects. The officer also began to reflect on his past, realizing that arrogance had often clouded his judgment. He thought about times when he had acted too quickly, assumed he was right without considering others, and ignored the value of foresight. Each reflection reminded him of the importance of patience, observation, and humility. The paint incident had been a vivid wake-up call, and he carried that lesson with him every day. Meanwhile, the general continued his work, quietly inspiring through example. He did not need to show off his wisdom or recount the incident. The lesson had been learned, and its ripple effect was visible in the officer's actions and the subtle shifts in the community. The general understood that the most lasting influence is often delivered silently, through calmness, foresight, and integrity. By the end of the week, the officer found himself acting almost instinctively differently. When faced with challenges at work, he paused to think. When interacting with neighbors, he listened more and judged less. He realized that the lessons from that night were not just about respect for one person, but about a way of living, thinking ahead, acting thoughtfully, and approaching life with humility. The officer sometimes thought back to the vibrant colors that had covered him. What had once been a source of shame had become a symbol of transformation. The paint was more than just a mess, it was a marker of a moment that changed him forever. Each memory reminded him that actions have consequences, that patience and foresight are powerful, and that humility is the foundation of true strength. The neighborhood, too, benefited from the lesson in its own quiet way. People noticed the officer's changed behavior, and even those who had doubted him began to trust him more. The community began to recognize the value of reflection, patience, and humility, not just in one person, but as a principle that could guide interactions and decisions for everyone. The officer never forgot the moment the general had simply stood and watched, arms folded, letting the experience speak for itself. That single act of calm observation, combined with the harmless but striking paint, had made an impression deeper than any lecture or reprimand could have. It was a lesson in strategy, patience, and human understanding, one that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. In the end, the paint incident became more than a story of embarrassment. It became a story of growth, humility, and the quiet power of foresight. The officer had learned that real strength comes from thinking ahead, respecting others, and understanding the consequences of one's actions. The general, in his calm and patient way, had shown that teaching without anger or confrontation often leaves the most lasting impression. Weeks turned into months since the paint incident, but its impact remained fresh in the officer's mind. Every time he faced a challenge, he remembered that night, the sudden splash of color, the overwhelming shock, and the quiet gaze of the general, calm yet commanding. It had been a moment of embarrassment, yes, but more importantly, it had been a moment of clarity. He realized that life often teaches lessons in the most unexpected ways, and sometimes the hardest lessons come from our own mistakes. The officer had changed significantly since that night. His colleagues noticed it immediately. He no longer rushed into decisions, he listened more, and he treated everyone with a level of respect that had been absent before. Where he once relied solely on quick thinking and confidence, he now considered consequences, anticipated challenges, and acted with patience. It was a transformation that went deeper than behavior. It touched his understanding of responsibility, humility, and human interaction. The community began to see a new side of the officer as well. Neighbors who had once watched him leave the general's house dripping in paint now observed a man who moved with purpose but without arrogance. He greeted people politely, assisted those in need, and acted thoughtfully in situations that might have previously provoked impulsive behavior. The lessons he had learned were evident not just in his actions, but in the way he carried himself. His presence no longer intimidated or provoked curiosity, it inspired trust. The officer also took time to reflect on his life before the incident. He thought about past mistakes, moments when he had acted without considering consequences, and opportunities he had lost due to impatience and ego. Each reflection brought clarity. He realized that the paint, though initially a source of humiliation, had become a symbol of transformation, a physical reminder that impulsive actions without foresight can lead to consequences far greater than one expects. In his personal life, he noticed subtle changes too. Conversations with family and friends became more meaningful because he listened more attentively. Decisions about his career were now weighed carefully, considering both immediate outcomes and long-term effects. Even in small things like how he handled conflicts or managed tasks, he approached situations with thoughtfulness. The paint incident had become a turning point that extended far beyond a single night. It had reshaped his character. Meanwhile, the general continued his life with quiet dignity. He returned to his routine, visiting the community center, tending to his garden, and engaging with neighbors. He never mentioned the incident to anyone and did not seek recognition for the lesson he had imparted. To him, the value lay in the outcome. The officer had learned, grown, and changed. The general understood that the most profound lessons are often delivered subtly, without fanfare, and that true wisdom does not seek applause. One day, the officer found himself walking past the general's house. He paused, remembering the night vividly. With a sense of gratitude, he approached the door and knocked gently. The general opened it with his usual calm demeanor, and the officer greeted him respectfully. "Sir," he began, "I wanted to thank you again. That night taught me more than I could have imagined. I understand now that patience, respect, and thoughtfulness matter more than quick action or pride. I hope to carry this lesson throughout my life." The general nodded, his expression calm and measured. "Growth is more important than perfection," he replied. "You have shown